So thank you for being with us
Yeah,
today. We are working on our senior thesis dissertation, Balkan in America. So
nice.
first, question is, can you tell us about yourself? What is your name?
Sure.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
Sure. So my name is Nevena Jevtić. I was born in central Serbia, specifically Jagodina. That's where my family's from. We are from a town kind of 30 kilometers or so from Jagodina, so we're in a rural mountainous area. Um, I was born in Serbia and lived there until I was about 5. And then just before I turned 6, we moved to the US, specifically Chicago. And I've lived in Chicago basically since. I haven't lived in any other part of the US. Grew up here, went to all my schooling is in Chicago, so I've really kind of mostly grown up here. But those 5 years were very like detrimental in my development early on. So it's kind of like it feels like I've lived there longer than I have, but Chicago is my home, so.
So why did your family move from Serbia to the United States and
Sure.
specifically Chicago?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of the old age question, I guess. It's kind of for a better life, right? That's what everyone who moves to the US usually from the Balkans for. It's a little bit of a unique story in the sense that my mom was born in the US. So my grandparents on my mom's side actually lived in the US in the 60s and 70s, like late 50s, 60s, and then moved back to Serbia in the 70s, which is kind of like a backwards way. So my mom and aunt were born here. They were born in Milwaukee, and just with the times and how things were, and my grandparents were very much kind of, do anything you can for work. Very little education coming from, mountainous village area from Serbia. They kind of got, the work they did was what they could get. And so that was not very conducive to raising children here. And so what they did was, long story short, they actually took my mom and my aunt back to Serbia to be raised by their grandmother while they continued working here for another 10 or so years. And then they moved back. And so when my parents eventually decided to move to the US, it was kind of like a first generation thing, even though they had some background and a few family members here. But we come from, like I said, a very, a farming background. My grandparents owned like the town store back in Serbia in the 90s. And so there was very little prospects in terms of like, a beneficial life there. And my mom had, an American passport. She had American citizenship. So they decided to just kind of give it a try here. They had a little bit of family here at the time. And so they, came over and then eventually we came along too. So it was kind of that's a roundabout way. So I say I'm first generation, but it's not like technically true, but I feel like I am just because of, the opportunities and stuff that came along later. So
We've noticed that across the country there are strong Balkan communities, but that each one is a little different. Obviously,
yes.
most people know that there's a ton of Serbs in Chicago. That's like the thing, the
Yeah.
statistics, fun
Yep.
fact, whatever you want to call it. So what do you think about the Serbian community in Chicago, the Balkan community? Can you tell
Sure.
us a little bit about what it's like?
Sure. When we first moved to Chicago, I feel like we were definitely closer to the Serbian community than now that I've kind of have my own life and, um, I'm an adult essentially kind of, it's up to me now to be part of that community, right? It's not my parents doing anymore. But when we first moved to the Chicago area, we lived on the northwest side of Chicago, which was very heavily in that time um, ex-Yugoslavia populated. So there were a lot of refugees. There were a lot of people from basically every country in the Balkans. Um, when we first moved here, we did live with a church, kind of like within the church. So my parents maintained the church facilities, and we had room and board there. So I was very, like that was part of like my everyday life. Really was being part of that community. So I, danced in the folklore group. Um, we, were kind of went to all of the concerts at the time, all the singers that would come to, to the States, in Chicago specifically, we'd go. So it was very, very, like much closer, was very much embedded in our everyday life. My grandparents also lived here with us for many years. And so they were a big influence in terms of staying connected to the community. going to the, Serbian stores to buy newspaper, going to buy, kind of buy the, groceries and goods. And so it was very, it was a very unique situation. It was kind of like a world of its own within this giant city. And then, during that time too, met a lot of people who were not Serbian, who were, Bosnian, Croatian, basically every country. And I always kind of think of that time that was like late 90s, early 2000s. We at one point had we actually celebrated Slava one year, and there was the whole Balkans was around our table. Like it was unbelievable. It is a religious holiday, but the religious part was like a component of it, and then the food and the connection was the bigger component of it almost. And so it was like we had people that were like Bosnian Muslim and Croatian and Macedonian and like Serbian all around the table. And no one really paid attention to the differences at the time, even though it was like still relatively fresh with the conflict that was going on there in the 90s. And then so that was, I think it was a little bit kind of like the closest I've ever been to the community. These days, I still kind of go to the church closest to us. I don't, go every Sunday or anything like that. It's just not even back in Serbia how we go to church. We don't go every Sunday, but when there's an event or something, we'll go. So I feel like my connection to the community these days is more so this profile, and then also just the events I can catch or go to. It looks very different than what the connection, what the community looked like before. And it's definitely true that there are so many Serbian people in Chicago. I think the latest statistics I saw were like there was more people in Chicago that were of Serbian descent than like in Serbia. So it's definitely we're very lucky here and very spoiled in that sense, because our products are all over the place, restaurants. It's very easy for me to like go, and right now at any given moment I can find like 5 restaurants in the area that I can go to for food. Whereas I speak to people all the time that are in like Denver and, in Toronto and all, they're like Texas that don't have anything nearby. So it's a very unique situation.
Yeah, I find it interesting like that you brought up the concerts and then the restaurants and stuff. It's funny because later I'm actually going to a place called Cafe Balkan to buy tickets to the Mile Kitić concert in Arizona. So yeah. I think maybe the Serbian community, Balkan community in Arizona specifically is but to a smaller extent because we also have restaurants, like the food products. My baba, she lives here in Phoenix. Like she gets all her products from our different like Euro markets and stuff like that. So I think it's like an amazing thing to like that we have these restaurants around us and that we're able to keep our cultures alive and retain connections to our homelands that way.
Yeah, I visited Tampa recently, and I have a friend who lives down there, and I was kind of like, okay, so like, where's the Balkan store? Or like, is there a restaurant nearby? She goes, well, there's one, and I was like, okay, that's a start, and I'm like, oh, what's the, it's each location I've been to is a very different vibe in terms of the community. In Milwaukee, for example, you have a lot of like second, third, fourth generation Serbian people. And I know at one point Milwaukee was like it was like equal to Chicago. Now it's a very different vibe. Everywhere you go, the community is a very different vibe. Even Indiana, like it's crazy how it's not very far, but it has a very different feel to it.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. Like in California, I think there's more like second, third generation. Yeah. That's something I've also noticed. So I've been following your Balkan hostess, Balkanska domaćica page for a few years now, and I really like all the recipes you share, and I've actually like made some of them.
Oh my gosh.
And I've noticed, so sometimes I try to find like a recipe in Serbian, and just the way they write recipes is so confusing. Like the steps aren't always written out, and I feel like in the US and stuff, like just the way we think, like we need things numbered. So I really appreciate that you do it to make it like accessible, I guess.
Yeah.
So my next question is, what is the story behind Balkan Hostess? Like how did you get started with that?
Sure. I think I took a little bit of both worlds really, and I feel like I'm a combination of both influences because I'm very much like in one way American, very much Serbian, another like equally. So I kind of took a little bit of both. Like I need for like the step by step with the traditional recipe. So I love this question. I think it's really kind of interesting because everyone's like, what did you like? How did you even start this? And when I was in college, I was kind of like getting into like being more interested in cooking. So I would follow like food, YouTubers. So that was my first kind of introduction to a process, if you will. And obviously I watched my mom cook and my grandma, and I always kind of was like interested. I was, it was always helpful and stuff. I like to do that, but it was never like, oh, let me pay attention. It was more of like, I just want to, or like, I was like, hey, come here, help me. Like I had to help it, whether I wanted to or not. And then I kind of in college started getting more into like like the YouTubers were very big at the time. Like it was, the beauty YouTubers, the food YouTubers, they were all kind of getting started. And so, I started following a couple and I was like, well, I feel like I can do this. And like, so I just kind of, it was in the back of my mind. I was like, yeah, but this is like, that's like a lot of work and like the video editing and I don't know how to film and I can't even do the YouTube thing. So, I was like kind of like put in the back burner, just continuing on with my life. And then, I was consulting during COVID. And when COVID started, all of our projects, we were about to hit a really large like bandwidth in terms of our projects. We had so many lined up, and then COVID happened, and literally overnight, everyone was like paused with all their projects. So I had a lot of free time. And then, of course, all like the, Instagram and TikTok was not around at the time, but they were like sourdough. Everyone's making sourdough. Everyone's making Dalgona whipped coffee. Everyone's making all these like viral things. And I was like, everyone's cooking. I'm like, I have like this extra time now. Maybe I like do this, but not in a YouTube way. Was not going to do YouTube. And so I was talking to our marketing person on our team, and she was like, well, she's like, if you're going to do it, this is probably the best time to do it. And so I was like, well, I don't know where to start. Like, what do I even call it? And so she's like, well, let's get on a call and start looking at domains and whatever's available. Like, we'll find it. And so I had a couple different things like names kind of potentially lined up, and like two, like I had three, and then two of them were taken, and the third one was Balkan Hostess. And I was like, okay, if it's available. And she goes, it's available. And I was like, all right, that's what it is. And so I kind of was like, I don't know what to do. And I was like, I have all these things. And before that, I was actually like totally spamming my Facebook and Instagram like profiles because I was like making stuff all the time. And so I was already posting it. And so I'm sure some people were like so sick and tired of like all I've ever posted was like pictures of things I made. And then I was like, well, I'm gonna just do a separate thing. And like if they want to see those pictures, then they can just follow me there. And so I was like, well, it's if I get like 100 people, even if it's the people and like off of my Facebook and Instagram that just want to see it, that's fine. It's just going to be an outlet for me. So I was like, okay, I'll do it. So I kind of started, all the back end stuff. And then the first 100 came and I was like, okay, that's what I thought was going to happen. And then like the next 200 and the next 300 and then the next like 1,000. And I was like, oh my God, there's so many people. And then a lot of people from like the Balkans were following too. And I kind of was like at one point wasn't sure what to do because I was getting a lot of feedback that like your recipes aren't in Serbian, your recipes aren't on Instagram in the little description, they're on a blog, it's an extra step. And I was kind of like, oh, do I even do this anymore? Like I speak Serbian, and I'm fluent in Serbian, but I'm not grammatically correct in Serbian. And so I was like not gonna take on writing the recipes in Serbian. And then I was like, well, like honestly, do you need my recipe for like Sadama if you're in Serbia, bro? Like, like, are you going to come to me for those things? You got to like, you have someone ask there, you're there, and then people, people were like, yeah, they're going to ask you because even though they're there, they're not going to have someone to ask. So I stuck to it. I didn't go that route. I just kind of continued. And it's really, I don't even know like what happened, to be honest, because it's just like a hobby for me. And now that it's kind of getting up in the numbers that it is, I'm trying to find out like what other prospects can come from it. But it's still very much kind of like that, hey, like I have some free time. And even though it's not that much free time these days, it's still something, it's a creative outlet for me. And just, it's great. It's a really great connection to people too. So that's the long answer. Yeah.
That's amazing. And yeah, like you do serve a specific like target market.
Yeah.
I also study marketing. So
yeah,
I noticed that like when you said like, well, I'm making recipes in English, they're already in Serbia. Like, why do you need my recipe in Serbian? I think that's really cool. That like you have that specific target market and that you've stuck to that.
Yeah, my ultimate goal really was when I was kind of like poking around like what was my purpose. And that was really like I wanted to have these recipes available for people that are like second generation, third generation, fourth generation that don't have anyone to ask anymore, or they're maybe marrying someone that's has Balkan heritage that they want to cook for, which ended up being that's what ended up happening. I have a lot of followers that are in that situation, but it was more so for the educational piece. It was like I want to be able like to appeal to an audience that's here or like anywhere in an English speaking country, I guess, or in Europe, that doesn't have that access to, or just can't understand the written Serbian recipes, or ate something when they were little growing up and now their baba's gone or their mom's gone and they can't ask anyone. So it was more so kind of like getting people to still continue to cook those recipes and connecting people who are, like I said, third, fourth, fifth generation, who don't even maybe speak Serbian anymore. Maybe it's just, kind of that's their heritage. So that was the primary purpose really was that.
So learning and making Balkan recipes is obviously a significant way to sustain our cultures. You talked about, especially for like second, third, fourth generation in our everyday lives while being far away from our homelands. And then I'm sure many people have never even had the opportunity to their homelands and try the food there. So how do you think that food can serve as a point of unity amongst members of the Balkan diasporas and even to like build an understanding of the Balkans?
Yeah, I think all connections really start with food, especially, and it doesn't matter like what country you're talking about. You can, again, I'm so lucky I'm in Chicago because we have one of the most amazing food scenes here. Like you pick a point on a map and you put a finger in a country and I'm sure you can find a restaurant in Chicago from that country. So, I think it all the, really like getting to know a culture or getting to closer to a culture, it all starts with food. And I think, especially in Balkan culture, because there's this mentality of like cafe culture or like coffee culture, and it's the rituals. It's not necessarily even about the coffee. The coffee can be crap. Like it doesn't matter, it can be like American coffee. It can be, there's so many like older men that meet at the Starbucks by my house that are like, I don't know what they are. Their like, dialects are kind of mixed. I'm thinking it's probably like a couple different countries, but they meet like every Sunday. They're the loudest bunch in that Starbucks. I'm sure they probably try to kick them out at some point, but we know they're always there. And I'm like, I go in and I'm like, oh my God, like, please don't let them know that I'm like from the Balkans because it's going to be a conversation. And so but they meet there. The coffee at Starbucks sucks. Like it's been, there's like, that's a well-known fact. Like you go there for like the sugary things. So they go there and drink their black coffee, but, they connect every Sunday. And so it's the ritual that brings people together. And I think, these kinds of recipes, these foods, there's different recipes from different areas of the Balkans that, kind of like people enjoy, right? You don't have to be from Bosnia to enjoy, Udmašice or whatever. That's the connection point. And so, it's also, Balkan culture is very like slow and like slow paced, whereas Americans very fast paced. And so it's all about the experience, like slow down, have some coffee, like sit for a minute, let's talk. And so it brings people together. And I think just it doesn't matter like where you're from the Balkans you're from. Like I think it just serves as a great, a restaurant that's in the Chicago that's maybe owned by a Bosnian family will serve all the Balkans. A restaurant that's, in Chicago that's Serbian is going to have people from all the Balkans coming to get their cevapi or whatever it is. So it doesn't really like that line doesn't exist when there's food. I feel like not as much as any other topic or area. So
what are some differences that you've noticed in practices in making and sharing food between American and Balkan cultures? So in regards to recipes, customs behind eating, sharing food, and so forth.
It's very different. Balkan culture is very, like I said, slower. So a lot of the dishes take time to prepare. It seems like a lot of ingredients, but they're really not. They're like, a key bunch of ingredients, if you will, and then like a couple of like common spices that are found throughout most dishes. So it's not like this giant heap of like spices you need, like Indian cooking, like that's like a drawer full, right? It's the key like 6 or 7 spices that you use basically in every dish. It takes time, which is not everyone's cup of tea. Some people are like, really? I need to do like I have to let it cook for 2 hours or like an hour. It has to like rise and then bake. That's like a whole, afternoon. And that's just kind of, that's the nature of the recipes. American culture is like, how can I make this in the least possible steps in the least amount of time? Like, can I use store-bought dough or can I use the crescent rolls and call it a day? And it's just not going to be the same. And I feel like all the more, and that's not to say like there are recipes that are like, American, which that's debatable in terms of like what's actually American food. There's this sense of kind of like all those like more complicated recipes are saved for like the holidays. So like that's when the legit cooking comes out is like Thanksgiving and like Christmas and like other, like holidays. But that's the major difference. I think it just takes longer to prepare and those complicated dishes are kind of reserved for like the couple times a year. But that's all kind of like comes with the territory, I guess.
So then going off of that, what is your favorite dish to make and share with your followers?
My favorite dish, I mean, it kind of like it's twofold. So my audience loves desserts. That's the most engagement. That's what gets we share the most. That's the most, it kind of like gets a rise out of people are those desserts. But I'm not a sweets person. So I love preparing desserts, more than anything else. But I'm not like, I will like make it and then like have someone like pick it up or like take it to work or give it away. So I'm more of like, I love the, more like savory dishes. I love the more, like breads and all of those things, the baked goods. So if I had to say like what my favorite dish, I don't have like a particular favorite dish that I've shared, but I want to say like I like sharing what I grew up eating. And I always feel like, oh, like no one's like, unless it's like a common recipe, like no one's eaten that. Like this is just like for my area or like something one of my, grandmother or aunt or somebody made up at some point. It's not common. And then I'll have people like, oh my God, like you ate that too. Or like, I know that, but we added this to it and it was the same thing. And so I love sharing what I grew up eating. I feel like those are the most authentic recipes. Not that everything else is not authentic. It's just, it's not maybe like widely known, like, your Gibanica, which is like all across the, Serbian region. But I like that. Those are probably my favorite. Those like really like, like, what is that again? I've never heard of that before. Those are usually my favorite. And then especially like some dishes that I found, I guess, are just from my region. Like those aren't, people are from Serbia and they're like, I'm from Northern Serbia. I've never heard of that. And I'm like, really? Because it's like literally a staple for us and down here in Shromadia. So it's so yeah, those like kind of like what I grew up eating, I guess, is what my favorite thing to share is.
So then kind of stepping back a little bit and taking
Sure.
like a big picture moment of everything. What do you think about the Balkan diasporas throughout America and overall building peace in America? Because there is a lot of tension, right, between these countries. So kind of what do you think about building peace?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. That's it kind of like, that was like a big topic, I guess, or big conversation in like the, late 90s, early 2000s. Like I said, when I moved to the US, the area we lived in, Chicago, was heavily refugee from all over the country, all over the Balkans. So in every type of refugee, so that was like a common thing. And so that, I'm not gonna lie, there were some I've never personally experienced, which I'm very lucky. I know it's not the case for some people, but when growing up in Chicago, I went to a school with a lot of Bosnian kids that were refugees. I went to school with Croatian kids and some Serbian kids. At the time, coincidentally, we weren't the majority wasn't like it was mostly Bosnian kids in my area and then some Serbian, but we were definitely my brother and I were the minority in our school. We were like if not the only Serbian kids, but also like very few Serbian kids. So depending like where, it really that your experience will be dependent on where you kind of grew up from. And then the late 90s with like the bombings in Serbia too, that was very high tension. It was very uncomfortable to say where we were from, especially like to American people, because all they knew was what was on the news. And so when you're like, 9, 10, 11 years old and you say where you're from, the look they would give you was like not a good one. And it was it was a little bit of like, you don't tell people where you're from at that point. These days, though, I feel like, there's been a couple generations that have have happened since then. I think building peace really starts from within. So, if we're exhibiting hate, it's because something we've been taught. No one's innately born with, hating a certain group. So I think it just ensuring that, when, if anyone's like kind of like out there like listening and feels a certain type of way about a certain type of group because of what they've been told growing up or what they've been taught, just pausing to like, if you find yourself kind of feeling that type of way towards a group of people or someone from a certain country or a certain religion or whatever it may be, asking ourselves like where it's coming from. Is it something I feel because someone told me I should be feeling about, this way about someone? And then, there are many people who came here as refugees. So I think, from all sides, like I mentioned, from, every country, I think it's important to recognize that and respect that everyone's experience or transition to the US or move to the US was not a peaceful one. Like mine was. It was not, like violence fueled transition. And also, I had an opportunity to come here that wasn't like many other people. It was a very unique situation. So just, I guess, just making sure you're aware that, not everyone's experience was the same, and then just respect everyone's experience. There are, people who have gone through some very traumatic things that, should be respected and acknowledged. And I think just overall, I think we still have a long way to go, definitely. But again, I've been very lucky. I can only speak from my experience in saying that I've never felt unwelcome anywhere. Even if I, was, in my grade school, like we went to school with a lot of Bosnian kids. And so at that time they would observe Bairam, in school, and they would gather all the kids and the moms would bring food and stuff. We were always included in that. Even though they were the only Serbian kids in school, we were always included in that. So I think it was a very, I'm very like grateful for that, because I don't know what my perception would have been if we were intentionally excluded from that. I think, building peace, that's a very hard question, especially with all the, the history behind the conflicts in the Balkans. But I'm not, I'm not seeing that as much, or at least hearing it as much now that I was when I was growing up. And I think it's just kind of the time has passed. And so the newer generations that are coming up, sure, they'll know about it, but it's not in the same context, where they may have like literally lived it, or their parents lived it, or what have you. So it's, I think it's changing a little bit.
Do you have any advice for us and whoever is listening on preserving our cultures while living in America?
Yeah, I think just a few takeaways for that. Take time to learn the history, take time to connect with your culture. Doesn't matter what country you're from in the Balkans. I think, like with my page specifically, it's not dedicated to any one culture specifically. I post most of my recipes are going to be influenced in some way by Serbian culture, because that's what I am from and that's what I know. But I also post recipes that are popular in other countries, and I plan to post recipes that are popular in like in Bosnia, Croatia, that are Bosnian, are from Croatia. And so I think, that's kind of like, the intention is to have all of that under one roof, if you will. But just, taking time to connect with your culture. If you're eating a food or a dish, something, Google it. I love like reading up. It's kind of a weird thing, but I love like reading about something I'm eating while I'm eating it in a weird way. So like if it's a dish, I love to like research that, like where it came from or how it came about. And so that's one way to do that. Start somewhere. Like if you don't know where to start, like, find one point and kind of like go from there. And if that means like visiting a restaurant to order one dish, then that's where you start. That's probably my best way. And then also get involved in your local community, whatever, how big or small it is. I think that for those who don't maybe have a large community where they're living that are, from the diaspora, like the internet is huge and wide and not always good, but there are profiles out there that their goal is to connect people from the Balkans. And so I think that's, it's one way to explore that as well, but nothing beats like in-person connection too. So I would seek out other people primarily to build that connection.
Yeah, I think the history is so important, because for me, like knowing about like history of the Balkans, that really like helps you put things into perspective, because as you were mentioning earlier, I feel like a lot of times like prejudices, like you said, and a lot of people like that were born in the United States but have Balkan heritage, like carry that with them without like any backing besides what they're told, even if their parents didn't want that to be like the result, or just like story and that happens. So I feel like knowing the history is like, that's a really good piece of advice, because that's what I've noticed. At least a lot of people that were born here don't really know the history of the region or the culture. And I think that's a really big way to overcome prejudices and to be more open-minded.
So I have a coworker and she's Greek. And everyone knows where I'm from and everyone knows where she's from because we're very proud of where we're from. And so everyone knows where both of us are from. Like there's no doubt about it. And I think, just kind of talking about it because, in my case specifically, like my name's unique, right? I mean, it's not unique in Serbia, but it's, it's people are still like kind of like surprised by it when they see it on paper or ask me what my name is. And so that's always going to be a starting point, right? That like if you have a really traditional Balkan name, you're going to get some questions. If you don't know the history that much, like if you're born here or like your parents were even born here, so you're like third generation, knowing a little bit of that just to kind of get the conversation going, because they're going to be, they're going to have people going to ask where you're from, especially if you have a name or your last name. So that will, raise some questions. It doesn't hurt to know a little bit of the history too.
Yeah, I think it's also funny about like how you said you and your Greek coworker, like everybody knows where you're from. I just feel like somehow that happens. And yeah, I think it has to do with the names and stuff. I mean, like I have an American name, but my last name, people are always like, is that Russian? What is that last name? And then like we connect, like we had a class together last year and I saw her last name and I'm like, so I looked up her last name on Google. It's like really creepy. Like during a Zoom class, I looked it up on Google. I looked up her last name. I'm like, it's Bulgarian. I knew it.
Oh yeah, that's always. I mean, I remember like when I was in school, I would always if there was like a list of people in the class, I would always go down a list and see if there was any other names that like looked Balkan. So and usually it wasn't the case. Sometimes I'd be like, oh, even now at work, like I'll see like people's names come through the inbox, and I'm like, oh my God, oh your like name's George, but your last name is not George. It's like very Balkan. So it's really cool to kind of see how that all collides. And of course my coworkers get all the tastes too, so they get to hear where I'm from and learn the history, whether they like it or not sometimes, and then they get to taste all the content batching. So well, thank you guys so much. This was so fun.
Thank you so much for meeting with us. It was really great talking to you, and we're excited about the recipes that you post.
Yeah.